Hi, everybody. We are a few minutes early. So for this moment, I'm going to eat this piece of broccoli.
Anyway, I'm Dan Garrison.
I'm Keith Baker. We're the creators of Phoenix Dawn Command, a new RPG, which is up on Kickstarter right now. Certainly anyone who's out there, please feel free to use the QA button to ask us questions, and we'll get that up right now to make sure we can see those questions when they come in. And for now, Dan, why don't you tell us something about the original genesis of Phoenix Dawn Command?
All right, I don't see any viewers yet, so this is strictly for YouTube later.
But we're there for you, YouTube.
Right. So I had a couple different ideas that kind of led to the genesis of Phoenix, and a lot of them come from GMing and playing as a PC in a lot of different systems, and just thinking a lot about why characters die. Right. So in some games, it seems like death is a threat that sort of motivates players, but you can't actually ever use it, right? If someone actually dies, I mean, we're limiting the agency in a game where, people are playing for agency. They're playing to have these powerful characters, and there's elements of identification and wish fulfillment, and death is sort of the ultimate kibosh on it. Then in other systems, death happens, but it's kind of meaningless. So
if you take, if your cleric can just raise you from the dead right after the fight,
5 times a day,
it's not, all it is a trip to the penalty box.
Right. So, but that said, like there are definitely situations where I, as a player, have had my character die, and I actually run a lot of convention games, and those are great opportunities to just say, well, we're never going to come back to this game, so let's just see what we can do, in the last hour. And when my characters die, it's been a lot of fun. It's been really dramatic. I feel like I kind of get to tell the part of the story that I never get to when I'm just playing in an ongoing game. So when I was thinking about those things, I was like, how do we make those opportunities happen more often in a game without necessarily making it so someone can't play anymore? And coming from that, I was like, well, we could just come up with a mechanic where you got resurrected all the time, let's say, but then it doesn't really have the finality of death, right? That's the penalty box problem.
Right.
So
then you're playing an MMO. Yeah.
So death had to be final eventually, but then I was like, is it just depressing to die each time? And what are we building towards? And then I was like, well, let's incentivize death. So that's kind of where I started thinking about, well, what if our characters got stronger every time they died, even as they're getting closer to final death? And that was just one of the first ideas that me and Keith came up with when we were starting to think of this setting.
And yeah, when the idea was sort of thrown on the table, it immediately grabbed me, in part for that same reason, that death is so rarely something you can really use. And, you take a moment like in Lord of the Rings where Gandalf holds the bridge against the Balrog, and that's just not the kind of scene I would ever see in a typical tabletop game, because as a game master, I'm never just going to create a thing that is so, okay, unless you all run away, you're all going to die. And certainly I wouldn't create that thing with a setup that assumes the only way to escape is for one of the players to die. And yet at the same time, those kind of moments, who's going to hold the bridge, are these fantastic moments. And so that was one thing, but also just again, from that immediate little nugget, that concept of, well, when you start out, who cares if you die once or twice? It's not that big a deal. In fact, you get better. But then the stronger you get, the more you have to actually manage your resources. And, by the time you're on your 6th or 7th life, you're suddenly very powerful, but if you die, it matters. And that again is a big change from the way a lot of games normally work, where, once you're like the huge, enormous, I can cast the wish spell powerhouse, in a sense, there's very little to worry about. You take D&D, well, once we can cast True Resurrection, who cares? Whereas with Phoenix, it really is, with great power comes great responsibility, essentially, and I really love how that just changes up the dynamic.
Well, and Phoenix just has a lot of components of resource management to it.
Mhm.
Even a high-ranked Phoenix, even though they're very powerful, only has a finite amount of health levels, of sparks, which is their magical energy to use, even lives to use, and that's actually a resource that an Elder Phoenix has less of than a new Phoenix. So,
and sparks are actually a sort of critical point to the game, because this is the magical energy that you use both to do cool supernatural stuff, but also that you can burn to sort of exceed your limitations and turn a bad hand into a better hand. And the two things about it, first, again, when you get to the more powerful Phoenixes, they can do more impressive stuff, but it costs more sparks. But also, it just is part of the most interesting sort of aspect of that game. The game is this whole, okay, I could accomplish this slightly cool, this cooler thing if I'm willing to burn a couple sparks to do it. Is this the time that makes that worth it?
Right. And actually, I want to go back
All right.
one topic too. You were talking about Gandalf on the bridge, right? One thing that Phoenix...
You shall not pass, sir. You shall not pass.
One thing that Phoenix, I think, kind of cleverly deals with that I haven't seen in other systems is that when a noble sacrifice is necessary in a lot of systems, it ends up happening to an NPC, right?
Mm-hmm.
It happens to a non-player character because no one wants to... Everyone agrees, okay, someone needs to sacrifice themselves, but it's like, not it, right?
Right.
But that said, what happens instead is, like, usually these powerful GM's characters, right? The Gandalfs, the Obi-Wan Kenobis, they make the noble sacrifice, and then you're like, oh, well, the GM's awesome character just got even more awesome by having this amazingly significant death, and I'm never going to die unless I roll a critical fail. I roll one, and that's not satisfying at all. So
it's true. Gandalf is the original game master character. He only pops up at critical times when he's needed, and he's the most awesome,
way higher level
guy.
than everyone else.
Yep.
Doesn't explain himself. So what's cool about Phoenix is, in Phoenix, you spend a lot of your time saving the non-player characters.
Right.
I actually feel like when people playtest Phoenix, they tend to care a lot about, mortals and civilians and so on, even when they're not strategically that important or really powerful.
Well, that also does tie very much to, part of character creation in Phoenix is essentially answering the question of why are you a Phoenix? What gave you the strength to come back? What have you lost? What do you still care about? Excuse me. So even at the lower level, people have had to think about why do we fight? And so then again, we try to then work those stories in. This isn't just any village, this is your village, and to really make it a reason to care about the innocents, as it were.
Yeah, and that ties into something that I think is really interesting about Phoenix, which is there's a common cause for the Phoenixes.
Yes.
You and your wing, which is your team, are all dedicated to saving the Empire from the Dread and to completing these missions and investigating the Dread and saving the citizens of the Empire from these threats. But that said, Phoenixes need to have a reason to come back, or else they wouldn't have, right? You would have stayed dead as immortal. So
because it's not easy coming back as a Phoenix, you have to fight for it.
Right, and the Empire's motto is your first life is your own, and the rest belong to the Empire, right? Phoenixes are expected to serve, but that doesn't mean every Phoenix needs to have a uncomplicated relationship with the Empire.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of cultures in the world of Phoenix, the Scavi, the tribes of the Grimwald, where these are essentially sort of client states that the Empire has defeated in the past. But that doesn't mean those people have been completely incorporated into the Empire. So if you're a Phoenix from one of those cultures, you may feel like there's a lot wrong with the Empire. It's just that the Empire may be our only hope, or Phoenixes may be our only hope against the Dread, which is sort of ultimate evil, right? So even if you feel like, oh, I don't like what the Empire is doing here, and the Empire has to make a lot of hard choices in its war against the Dread, you still will find reasons that your character wants to go on and sacrifice themselves for the Empire.
But that is the key point, is that everybody has to have a reason to be in this fight, but it doesn't have to be the same reason. And that's really part of thinking about who your character is, where are you from? How did you die? What is it that gives you this common cause? And when you get into the more complex sort of story levels of the game, part of it also is the fact that in the present day, the Phoenixes aren't part of the Empire. They're just this small group of folks sort of who have suddenly come back and are trying to fix the problems. But one of the things you will have to do is establish what is your relationship with the actual, government, army, things like that. And that's really something that different groups could take in different directions. But I would sort of say, in lieu of anyone asking questions, and again, if you're out there listening, there's a Q&A button on the Google Hangouts thing that lets you ask questions. So ask a question. But in lieu of that, I think it would be a good idea to actually talk for a moment about the Dread and, what the basic story here is. And so essentially, we have our known world, which in times past was united into this single empire by the first Phoenixes. Long story to how that ended. The Phoenixes ended up sort of going away. But then in recent years, just over the last couple of years, basically we have started having a host of different supernatural threats sort of manifesting across the empire. These come in many different forms, anything from shape changers to, the dead rising from the grave to hauntings to strange fey creatures, sort of any horrible thing you can think of, there's a chance it's out there somewhere. And the main point is we don't know, as people of the Empire, why this is happening or even how these things relate to one another. We know there's an army of the dead marching up from the south, but does that have anything to do with the crazy zombie plague that just destroyed one of our cities in the north? Or is the world falling apart? So we call this the Dread as if it's a big single thing. But part of the drive in the story of the game is trying to understand it. Is it a big single thing? What is going on?
Right. And what the Empire does know about the Dread is that more than anything else, these are supernatural threats that mortals can't deal with. Right. So even though they're Imperial legions, which are, standing armies that are supposed to defend the Empire's territory, they've been fighting a losing battle.
And part of the thing there, and again, if you have any specific questions, please use the Q&A button to ask us. Part of the thing there is the fact that this is essentially a low magic world. This is a world where magic exists and is a powerful force, but it was suppressed in past ages by the Empire, so it's not part of people's everyday lives. And this part of the point is, oh, we have this outbreak of this chant, this thing that anytime people hear it, they start chanting and trying to kill each other. By the time the Legion even hears about it, it's too late. It's already over. And alternately, you have an army of the dead, and well, the Legion can smash them and they'll just get back up. Again, sort of mortal forces, an army does not solve these problems. And that's where Phoenix is coming.
Right. And in the Empire, sort of the only doctrinal magic that does exist is that of the Phoenixes. And it's something that they haven't needed for centuries at this point. So because magic is not well understood, things that are magical are suspected to be either openings for the Dread to invade an area or infect an area, or they're just, it's plain dangerous, right? But you may, as a Phoenix, end up going to a town that is trying to defend itself from the Dread, but may not want your help because they're using magics that the Empire frowns on, but it's the only thing that's kept them going until now. So sometimes with Phoenix, your characters are trying to win the hearts and minds of the people you're trying to help, not just defend against these external threats, these monsters.
And that's very much, for me, when I made Eberron, part of the point was saying, let's look at the way magic works in Dungeons and Dragons, and let's think about how that would affect civilizations. With Phoenix, the whole point, again, is figuring out how magic works and how it affects the cultures and how it affects the development, but just in a very, very different way from how things work in D&D. And so one of the things I really like about the world is sort of everything we've developed about the different cultures and the magic and, what makes this not our world. But in Phoenix, that is essentially more of a mystery. Magic has been suppressed. And so what you're getting now is, as Dan said, people starting to use it because, oh my God, we've got to do something. And so there is more this discovery. You're in this time when essentially magic is really sort of starting to come back into the world in both good and bad ways.
Right. And so, a little bit more about the Empire. So the Empire is sort of I would say sort of like Roman influenced, but sort of a medieval.
Classical.
Yeah, so sort of a medieval to maybe early Renaissance level of technology. And the Empire is pretty sure it is the most developed civilization in our world, right? And that kind of hubris leads to the Empire sort of being complacent when the Dread first shows up, and maybe overreaching when they think a simple solution will solve, fighting the Dread. And what they are discovering now, as they are in retreat, and large portions of the Empire have been lost to the Dread, is that the existing power structures are desperate for an answer. And so that's kind of the Phoenix's avenue to help, even though not everyone is familiar with what a Phoenix might be, except having heard the legends.
And this is sort of the whole point, is that, we get a pack of werewolves savaging a village. And jumping in there and killing the werewolves, well, that's something. You've saved a bunch of villagers. But if you can't figure out where are werewolves coming from, what are werewolves about, why are they even here, then all you're really doing is, again, putting out a fire. You're not understanding how to stop it from happening again. So it's an action game. There's a lot of very intense action and such. And yet, at the same time, what drives the story is essentially discovery.
Right. What if it turns out the werewolves are the villagers?
Yeah.
What if they're doing it to fight off the Dread that's attacking their town? Which is worse, right?
Yeah.
And what's one thing that's cool when I see people play test is that because there aren't like cut and dry answers for these things, some Phoenixes in the wing are going to be like, oh, we need to stamp out this magic and kind of get these villagers on the straight and narrow, even if we may lose this town. And other ones are like, well, they're just doing what they got to do, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe we go fight the Dread first, and then maybe we can convince them afterwards to abandon kind of these heretical ways that these villagers are attempting to do. Or alternatively, maybe the ritual that is creating these werewolves is really the source of the problem. Even though Phoenix uses a lot of sort of supernatural fantasy horror tropes, these monsters aren't really exactly like the monsters that we encounter in other stories and other media.
And that's the thing I'd say is, and first off, if you're out there watching and you have a specific question in mind, please use the Q&A button to ask us questions, because otherwise we're just talking about what we want to talk about. But that is a key point, is really, to me, it's the same way how with Eberron, we took a lot of traditional D&D tropes and tried to sort of turn them on their head a little. Here it's the same idea. We're taking the basic concepts people are familiar with, zombies, skeletons, things like that, but they're not necessarily going to we're trying to get deeper stories and have things that behave in ways that will surprise you. And that actually comes to with our stretch goals. We have a bunch of really good writers and designers coming up with essentially new challenges, new threats you'll face. And part of that is about coming up with not just a set of, a monster to beat up, but a story and sort of something that has a really interesting way to build adventures off of. And I'm really happy with the first one I've seen. So.
All right, Keith, I have a question for you, actually.
Yes.
So you've talked a little bit about how your experience with Eberron has led to Phoenix.
Mm-hmm.
But tell me, you have another game that
That's
also
true.
involves bad things happening to your characters before their death.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what makes you win in that game.
That is true. So, and again, if anyone has any questions, please ask. So I really do, for me, where I'm coming from, I really do see Phoenix as this bastard child of Eberron and Gloom. Because it is a
tell us more about that.
Well, it is a fantasy role-playing game. So like Eberron, there is this whole world that is really interesting to explore and ongoing characters and, all of that. And yet at the same time, it's a card-driven game, like Gloom, in which you want your character ultimately to die.
Or
and yet at the same
the best
time,
story on the way there.
But that's the key point. At the same time, just like in Gloom, you don't want to just throw a death on your character before anything happens. You want to build it up and have a solid story. And it's the same way with Phoenix. Something we didn't quite touch on is the fact that you're not, you can come back after death doesn't mean in a game you're not going to care about dying. Most of the missions and adventures are very much, the stakes are high, the odds are very much against you, and quite often time is going to be a factor, and you don't come back right away when you die. And so it is more that thing about sacrifice, that it's more, someone's probably going to have to die before this is all over, but you don't want it to happen too soon or too casually. The other thing I would say, going back to Gloom, is that one of the things I like about Gloom is that it encourages storytelling. However, where the two are different is in Gloom, storytelling has no practical effect. It really is just for fun, and the cards help encourage it. In Phoenix, you do have a very practical, I have these cards in my hand that give me hooks for storytelling, and if I can explain how they apply, how my vengeful nature or, the fact that I've seen this before, well, where have I seen it before? If I can tell you that, I get to play this card. And so it is that finding ways to encourage storytelling, even if it's not something people,
right.
normally do.
And to me, that's one of the interesting things about Phoenix is there are a lot of, especially these days, there are other card-based, fantasy games out on the market. But and oftentimes I think of cards or playing pieces that sort of limit you because it's really you do what's on the card, right?
Right.
But with Phoenix, the cards are kind of a starting point for making you kind of show off what your character can do, and it's in a way that is very different from the character sheet, or even having a long backstory to your character that you've thought up, because you actually show the traits of your character in play. You get mechanical bonuses for it. You're encouraged to do it, and it's fun. And so even though someone may not have heard the backstory of your character, they'll know who your character is just by watching you play the game.
You're that crazy, vengeful guy with a death wish who's seen it all before. On top of that, I think it's important to note that the Game Master doesn't use the same kind of cards that players do. The main thing the Game Master has are challenge cards, which are the things people deal with. But part of it is the fact of the matter is you can make your own challenges. It helps to have like a file card or something out on the table. But the thing is, again, in a lot of games, you have to have, the cards define where are we, what are we doing. Here, the cards are the tools for the players. to accomplish their actions. But the game master is still sort of mainly relying on imagination and storytelling. It's not solely a card
Right.
game, if that makes any sense.
And yeah, and since the only sort of randomization point is in the decks in the hands of the players, as a GM, I think it's relatively easy to come up with challenges because you only need to come up with sort of static numbers for, say, the attacks of your monsters or the difficulty of your challenges, and there's some pretty good guidelines in our GM materials that let you know, like, this is what a hard attack to defend against would be rated at, or this would take someone with a superhuman level of this skill to do.
I'm smiling at this because I did once in an early playtest when we just didn't have an adventure written up for things. Basically, just had everyone at the table grab a file card and draw me a monster, and I just quickly figured out what their stats would be and just built an adventure around those 5 things, and it was actually a ton of fun. And while again our adventures that the game is shipping with actually have very tight, deep stories, one thing I do like about Phoenix is you can put together a story pretty quickly on the fly. It doesn't take a ton of GM prep.
Right, and if you want to kind of get eased into that, there are actually parts of even the written adventures where where there are opportunities for your players to define, the qualities of an NPC that they're meeting, or some of the details of the minions of the dread that you fight, and those things are mostly there to sort of add world detail and to kind of create a more vivid scene. But I think you'll pretty quickly find that you can use these to structure your own scenarios as well.
Well, we're almost out of time here, so again, we really have time for one more subject. So if you got a question out there, now would be the time. And we didn't ask if Phoenixes were allowed to date other Phoenixes.
I can just go into that.
And there is the missing 4th suit. So yeah, in lieu of a question, again, last chance, what do you got for us, Dan?
Okay, so what kind of relationships can Phoenixes have, right? So I think one interesting thing about the setting is, in sort of Imperial doctrine, Phoenixes are not the people that they were as mortals, right? I mean, your skills are massively magnified, and you have these magical powers, but you also live your lives serving this purpose. You have to defend the empire.
You take a new name.
Right, and you do take a new name, and
we have a question.
Okay.
All right. Let us put that up.
Okay.
Mind if I start?
Please do.
So, I like the idea of making death and sacrifice meaningful, but players may have a hard time getting used to the concept. Have you found yourself pushing players to sacrifice? So first off, Phoenix characters come in different schools, and the different schools, they give them different powers, things like that. One of the classes is the Durant, who is hardest to kill. And I find that's a great sort of starting point for the player who you think really is going to have a hard time with this concept, because they are the character least likely to die. Conversely, you have the Bitter, who is stronger the closer they are to the edge. And that's the character most likely to die. And I have never had any trouble getting people to jump on playing the Bitter. And
yeah, the Bitter's a lot of fun. It's up there for my favorite school.
So I think I've never had any trouble when it comes to, like, here's the dramatic moment. We have, for example, a bomb, and you could try a really hard thing to defuse it, and if you fail, everyone in the room will die, or one of you can jump on that bomb. In that type of situation, there's usually a player who's like, oh, I want to do that, because again, like, if this was the movie, this would be the dramatic moment, and usually people are pretty excited about being able to have those moments.
It's also your level up opportunity.
Yes.
In a way, if you can succeed at your mission, there are ways that dying almost feels like a reward, because you're going to come back leveled up.
Right. At the same time, what I do find, the thing that does take people time to get used to is the fact that when you're attacked, you use cards from your hand to defend yourself against the attack, and you don't draw back till the end of your turn, which means anything you play to defend, those are cards you won't have to do something cool when your turn comes around. And most people have an instinctive, if I can avoid an attack, I should. And what you need to sort of learn as a Phoenix is you can take a bit of banging around, and frankly, death isn't the worst thing that can happen. So sometimes it is better to take a hit or two, even when you could avoid it, to hold on to cards to do something really cool on your next turn.
That's one of the great things about the Bitter School, actually, is I feel like the person playing the Bitter School Phoenix often inspires everyone else to
be more
live a little and use the sparks and lose a couple of health levels in order to get stuff done, because the bitter is always doing awesome things. Like,
right.
The bitter's like, I don't give a.
Yeah, the bitter you want to take a hit or two, to sort of get charged
just
up.
To get started. So, and then people are like, oh wow, like bitter is always doing really awesome things, and then everyone else is like, oh, I can do that too. So now, because your school in your next life is defined by the type of death you have, not every Phoenix needs to be really self-sacrificing or noble. I mean, the bitter dies in failure, right? So he's most often going to have a death where, he's trying to
angry
murder
about
something and he gets murdered first. So, but that said, there's always lots of opportunities to die in the adventures as they're written. And we've written them, so there are lots of opportunities for different ways that Phoenixes can die. And
that's the key point, again, that we were bringing up earlier in the talk, is the point that these are very different adventures than the typical thing you would get in your standard, like, dungeon crawl or something. These are adventures where the stakes are really high, and there's a lot of tension to it, and it is if no one throws themselves on that bomb, everyone in this building will die. So who's taking that thing? So given that tone, again, the stories themselves put people in this mindset that we're going to have to make sacrifices. So it's usually not hard to get people, prepared to do things. Now, at the same time, we have a little sort of shawarma scene in one of our current demo adventures, where essentially this sort of mysterious fae sort of creature basically offers you this magical amulet that does nothing for a Phoenix, but if you give it to a mortal, it will save their life. You could give it to the Emperor. You could give it to your sister. You have a chance to save one mortal's life, but it will cost you one of your lives. Now, that is one where, from a purely abstract metagame standpoint, I'm just offering you a chance to level up and get a cool thing. And yet a lot of people do really think hard about that and like, oh no, they're not just throwing away their lives, in part because of the character generation. I think people do get invested in their characters and don't tend to think of it as just
it's a good question. I think always is, Phoenixes have multiple lives, but they're finite, right? So what is the worth of a Phoenix's life if they're going to come back, say, with the next dawn, versus a mortal who may never get another chance after this? And who would you give it to? Who is, if you could save one guy, who is that? And also, if you're giving up one of your Phoenix lives, how many mortals could you save if you were living that life and to its final point? So it's something that players grapple with, and it's always really interesting to see what the players are doing with that.
All right, that brings us to the end. So I think we can go ahead and stop here. Thanks everyone for listening. We're up at Kickstarter as Phoenix Dawn Command. You can also find us online. It's togetherstudios.com. That's TWO Gether Studios. And thanks so much for listening, and we'll have more updates about Phoenix in days to come. Thanks again. Take care.